whether it is the shortage of oxygen, whether it is new protocol of how remdesivir is to be used, whether it is the price of vaccines or the non-availability of vaccines, it seems like the judiciary has stepped in where administration in the system and governments have completely failed. With citizens left with nowhere to turn, they're turning to courts, and high courts and the Supreme Court seem to be stepping in. They are sounding off governments, they're taking them up, they're giving them ultimatums, they're asking them to provide oxygen, they're the listening post for hospitals, for patients, and for all kinds of stakeholders in the middle of this COVID crisis. The question is, how far does their remit go? What is the role that the judiciary should be playing at this point, and can they really help? To speak on this, I'm joined by two top lawyers, Sanjay Hedge and Karuna, Nundy, to give us some perspective. Thank you to the both of you for joining us today. Mr. Hedge, let me start by getting your take. A lot of snippets that we read and we see in papers, they're reported on social media, is what the judges are saying during cross-examination or during hearings. There are observations, there are questions being put by honorable judges. Does this actually amount to anything, or will we have to wait for final orders to be passed to really judge what impact these words are having?
No, the impact will be seen on the ground. Is the judiciary clearing up the mess, or is it adding to the mess? I think so far the judiciary has had a carefully calibrated program of oversight of all that is going wrong on the ground. It has been trying to help where possible. It has been trying to cut through bottlenecks. It has brought officials together, asked for deadlines, asked for action plans. Ultimately, you see, given the state of the country today, given the state that Parliament is not sitting, given the state that there is no other forum where there can be a hearing, citizens are necessarily turning to the courts. And the court, like the Supreme Court said, it cannot remain a mute spectator. The courts are charged with defending your constitutional rights, including your right to life. And if your right to life is being taken away or being ignored or being stifled through bureaucratic ineptitude or lack of bureaucratic vision, at times the judiciary has had to step in. The thing is that various high courts are taking care of local level conditions. The Supreme Court has this week made it clear that it will pass orders which do not supplant the High Court's orders, but will be supplementing it. The Supreme Court will look at the macro picture. Micromanagement is at the High Court level. So within the judiciary now, there is a measure of coordination and control, and that is also being transmitted down towards the administration. I think what the judiciary has done so far is commendable.
Okay. Karuna, Nundy, this question came up very sharply in the case of Uttar Pradesh when the Allahabad High Court said that the state must go into lockdown. The state government said, no, we won't, and they challenged it in the Supreme Court. Can the High Court go as far as to ask an elected government to impose a lockdown or direct them on what administrative orders to pass?
It's always a fine line, because when at the first instance, a state or the center doesn't act in accordance with the Constitution through their policy measures, then the court has a duty to step in, but in a way that the policy remit isn't violated, right? What do you do when you see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people and their lives being risked? And as Mr. Hedge quite correctly said, the right to life is at the center, it's the fulcrum of our Constitution. It is why the state exists, right? It is why we're not just running around all killing each other in a might is right manner. So when that very fulcrum of the Constitution is being bashed at and either at best and ignored by a state government that is allowing masses and masses and masses of people to walk into their deaths, then what is a high court to do? A high court can issue a writ of certiorari, setting aside the order and then seeing what the state government does, indicating what would in fact be in accordance with the right to life. And then the state government can come back and say that, okay, look, here is the policy that I have designed. Or they don't have to come back. They can design a policy that is in accordance. And then it's up to someone to challenge it or not before the High Court again, right? But the interference of a court, I think, is absolutely required in these unprecedented times to protect the lives of the average innocent citizen. Because let us be clear, it is not only the person who goes to the rally or who goes into the Kumbh Mela who is at risk. It is the rest of the population they are putting at risk.
I want to understand this from a very specific example. Mr. Hegde, let me take this to you first. So, a hospital in Delhi is afraid that it will run out of oxygen by morning. They have patients at risk. They knock at the doors of the High Court and they say that we're running out of oxygen, do something. The High Court summons everyone, they rustle some oxygen for that night, but it is a continuing problem. It is an ongoing problem where the amount of oxygen required is not being supplied, or there are other issues in place. So if what the High Court has directed is not eventually carried out because of various circumstances, then what are the powers of the court? To what extent can they go? Can they hold the governments in contempt? How would it work out, and what would be the logical conclusion then of that endeavor?
First, I need to clarify about the Allahabad High Court. The Allahabad High Court never directed a lockdown. It directed the government to consider. And against that, the government came to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court stayed it. After that, when the other courts also got into the acts in their respective states, it was then that the Supreme Court decided no, let the High Courts do their job. Now, you asked a specific question with regard to a hospital. Yes, the courts have to pass orders depending on the situation of the day. The courts do not manufacture oxygen. The courts can at best direct that oxygen be fairly supplied. If there is deliberate violation of the court's order, the court can certainly take contempt jurisdiction. But the court has a moral authority which is much higher. All governments ultimately run on the rule of law. And the expounders of the rule of law are the courts. And if a court says, do this, and you have no reason for not doing it, then you would probably be seen as a government not adhering to the rule of law. Contempt or sending one officer to prison or finding another officer is not an adequate remedy, and it is of little solace to people who will lose their lives in the meanwhile. But if a court's order can cut through various Gordian knots of administration and deliver relief, and governments are bound to operate according to the rule of law, I would really welcome it. I would not go into the final question of what relief. This is like that classic question that Napoleon once asked. How many divisions does the Pope have? The Pope may not have had many divisions, but the papacy has continued and Napoleon hasn't.
I think another important aspect which we should highlight, and Karuna, if you want to come in on this, is that the court's intervention and demand of information also forces governments to transparently tell people via their depositions to the court what is going on. You get to know what the real picture is, what has been ordered, how much supply there is through these hearings. Is that also a very important function being fulfilled?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, one of the problems right now is of a system of information and a transparent one. So, somebody was asked because they did, their loved one died without oxygen. They said, "Aapne social media pe nahi dala." The journalist was saying, "Aapne social media pe nahi dala, aapne Twitter pe nahi dala." And he said, "Twitter kya hota hai?" Right? So the point is that this sort of very desperate attempt that people are making through WhatsApp, through their contacts, through Twitter, to gather together some mode of survival needs a system. So one of the things that the courts are doing, one of the things that the Delhi High Court is doing, is to attempt the sort of facilitation of technological solutions that are systemic and that people can access. And in fact, one of the things that we'll be asking for is bringing home-based care into the mix, because at the moment the people who are completely falling outside of the system are the people who are turned away from ICUs, the people who are turned away from hospitals because of lack of capacity, and the people who are dying in, as per the experience of somebody that I was attempting to help, somebody who died in the car just before he entered into the hospital, where an oxygen supported bed had been booked because he was in the car all day, you know? And so, yes, transparency is absolutely vital.
Okay. Also your take, Ms. Nundy, on what the courts can eventually do. How much can they, guarantee will be done? Because courts are now going into areas, and because of the current circumstances, that fall squarely under what the executive should be doing. Like mapping where oxygen goes, protocols for the use of remdesivir, even prices of vaccinations are under question before the courts. All of these things which are matters that the government should be handling. Will the courts coming into this delay the process, and is that a concern, or will it force governments to act even faster?
I think that the judges are keenly cognizant of this aspect of not having things enter into the normal court process, which of course, we know that our courts are hugely overburdened, but that to make sure that whatever orders are being passed and whatever facilitation is being done in order to make sure that things happen, right? With regard to the policy issue, I think we must remember that the standard of law has moved on from the Bolam test in interference of negligence in medical activity, right? And the Bolam test used to be that you can't make it, that basically that a decision mustn't be so extraordinary that no doctor would have made it, to more a Bolitho versus Hackney City Council like standard, which is now being brought into Indian law, which is that the courts are very equipped to hear experts and to make decisions that respect what the experts are saying and what the governments are saying, but also to ensure that they meet a particular standard. I think, this happens in a wide variety of areas. If you look, for example, at religious law, right? A completely different example of religious personal law. I think what some of our judges have said, and why I strongly support it, and I strongly stand for that same proposition, is that religions can decide what their law is going to be, whatever it is. I'm no expert on Sharia, I'm no expert on Hindu law. However, it cannot interfere with the fundamental rights of any person. And in the same way, I think that governments are free to organize themselves, and experts are free to, uh, um, you know, look at the supply of remdesivir, which is hugely hyped and is not apparently, some experts say, as useful as it's touted to be, and look at caps on the supply of oxygen, etc. But it must be above the floor of a fundamental right that the court will ensure.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Hegde, What are you hoping to see from the many courts across the country and the Supreme Court, which is seized of the COVID-19 matter right now? Do you hope to see that their intervention will help streamline processes, that people will not be dependent on WhatsApp groups and social media and the random kindness of stranger or black marketeers to save their loved ones?
I hope the court's intervention is benign, it is productive, and that it is not taken amiss by the administration, and it gets into the realm of further challenges. Today, the need of the hour is for all organs of state to work reasonably in harmony. Wherever there is one administration which says no, no oxygen will be restricted to the state of production alone, and there is another administration which wants oxygen. So it is for courts to step in and streamline such difficulties, ego fights, and whatnot. The court's job is currently to lend a calming hand on the tiller of state. You do not want the ship of state to run aground in this calamitous situation. Courts have credibility. Courts, after all, reach their decisions after full hearings, after hearing all sides. And as you rightly put it, this is the only place where there is some aspect of sunwai. The Indian mind greatly respects sunwai, greatly respects the very fact that they have been heard. So, giving voice to the voiceless, coming to reasonably considered, thoughtful decisions, and telling the administration to sort out their little messes. That is what I see the court job to largely be. Great judgments and all that may not come out of this particular exercise, because this is also an emergency exercise. We are right at the top of the surge.
Saved.
Well,
If lives are
when the surge
saved,
when the
that would be
surge dies down,
sufficient. If
I hope
lives are
they have
saved,
good
that
law
would be
come.
sufficient.
Yes. If
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sanjay Hegde and Karuna Nundy, for joining us today and speaking about what the role of the courts should be. Every citizen has to pitch in at this point, and we're looking to the courts to give some relief.